This is a video from my classes at SUNY Adirondack that are working on their final paper in the next couple of weeks. What I wanted to do today was walk you through some of the basics of working with sources, developing your case, and I'll be pointing you to a couple of online resources. So this is the week of the 20th, next week's the week of the 27th, the essay's due at the end of that week. In this week, we're working on revisions of essays, developing from early drafts and drafts that you've started working on. And so in these next 2 weeks, we're working on developing essays in most of my classes in MLA format, but in some of my writing classes in APA format. What I have to say here applies to both. And you want to consider that the format of an essay is just that. It's a format. It's part of the conventions of presentation. But as I've been talking about all semester, writing is not just about presenting, but it's also about discovery. Right? We write drafts to discover a thesis, to discover an issue, to explore that thesis or issue. We write to discover what we think and what we can know. We write to discover how we can draw on others' work to develop our own thinking. Right? This is why we go to the library. This is why we go to secondary sources. This is why we read. Right? Because we want to bring the work of others into our work to kind of build on what they're doing. Writing is thinking, not just a formal skill. So when we talk about MLA and APA, we're not just talking about format, we're talking about the use of sources, right? So there's the importance in writing of effectively integrating other people's work into our texts, right? Quoting them, paraphrasing them, summarizing them, and acknowledging that work. And acknowledging the work is totally uncreative. It's a convention. There are ways to do it. MLA and APA do it slightly differently, basically the same, but slightly differently. But quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing all have their uses as well. And those are creative acts, right? Because when we quote, when we paraphrase, when we summarize, we're doing something with that. We're bringing it into our essay, not because what we've just quoted, paraphrased, or summarized is obvious, but because we want to say something about it. We want to put it to use. We want to examine it. So this week we're working on developing our own arguments and analyses, right? Looking at the text that you're working most closely with. What do I want to take from those texts? What do I want to bring in? What do I want to analyze, think about, develop? And thus integrating others' language, directly their language in a quote, or their ideas if we're paraphrasing or summarizing, right? How do we bring that into our own writing? So part of this is about discovery. It's very creative. But part of this is also very conventional. It's not creative at all, right? It's just about presenting. And so I want to separate those two things as we've been talking about all semester. So the discovery aspect involves your creative selection of texts and your creative integration of key passages into your own writing, right? You decide what you're going to quote, why you're going to quote it, what you're going to do with it. Whatever you select as evidence or as an object of scrutiny for your text, what most matters is how you integrate the passages into your own writing. So let's talk about sandwiches and ice. Sounds like a strange thing to talk about. I've learned about that from students. When you quote a text, you want to set it up, you want to present it, you want to follow up on it. That's the way that we suture it, tie it into, integrate it into what it is that we're writing, right? So when you quote a text, set it up, present it, follow it up with a paraphrase and a discussion of significance, right? One way to think about this is a quote sandwich, right? It's a way to think about setting up, quoting, and following up. So you're building in layers, right? In fact, when we write a paper, it's not one big block of text, it has paragraphs. Every paragraph adds a new layer to my overall discussion. Within a paragraph, I also have layers. I have the main claim of the paragraph. I have the things I want to discuss to support that main claim. I have the quotes, the evidence, the data, whatever it is that I'm bringing in for the reader to think about that fits into that box of that paragraph. So every paragraph is a layer that's made of layers, just like a sandwich is layers, right? Set it up, present what you're bringing in, follow up on it. That following up is really important, right? That following up can include paraphrase, right? So I quote something. The meaning of that isn't obvious. I'm going to then paraphrase to explain to a reader what I want them to get from that. Not what they're going to think about it. They'll think about whatever they want to think about. But it's my paper. What do I want you to think about as you're reading my paper. I need to tell you that. I need to explain that. I need to really work that out. So that's the sandwich thing. Students last semester told me that they learned about this not as a sandwich, but as something called ICE, right? Where you introduce what you want to quote, you cite it, and you explain it, right? So I-C-E, introduce or set up, cite it, give it to me, tell me where it came from, and explain it. So that's the discovery aspect. It's very creative, right? The presentation aspect, again, it's not creative. It's just about following some rules or conventions where I am going to cite and document all the texts I bring into the writing. To cite a text is to signal within the writing the name of the author and any other key info usually in parenthesis. In MLA, it might just be the writer's name in the sentence or in parenthesis followed by a page number should we have one. In APA, we're also going to include a date, and there's a slightly different way to do the page, right? There's an abbreviation we use. So citing happens in the text where I signal to the reader, hey, I've got something here that comes from somewhere. If you look at the name that I give and you go to the end of the paper, there's an alphabetical list of all the sources that I cite in my essay, and that's where I document. I provide documentation of all the text that I worked with in my paper. MLA calls this a works cited page. APA calls it the references page. They essentially do the same thing. So rather than reinventing the wheel here, I wanted to point you towards some resources, and the text that I'm working from I will post in Blackboard for you to find. I found these videos online. One of them I've shared with a class already, but these are videos that explain key aspects of creative discovery in the use of sources, and then also a couple that represent or explain the uncreative conventions and presenting information about the sources that I'm drawing from. So the first is a useful video on the integration of texts in your essays. They're all YouTube videos. I find that that's a pretty easy way to kind of point you toward things. This is a video on how do I integrate text in my essays. It essentially covers a lot of what I've just talked about, just in some more depth with visual examples that you can see. This is very useful for you to look at. The second one is a discussion of integrating sources and avoiding plagiarism, right? Plagiarism is when I bring somebody's work or ideas or language into my paper without giving them credit. You always want to give someone credit, and you also want to be very clear about what comes from another source. This is a very useful short video. All of these are pretty short that explains how to integrate sources in order to avoid plagiarism. The last two sources are both from drawing on Purdue University's online writing lab, or the Purdue OWL. The first introduces the basics of MLA. The second introduces the basics of APA format for those of you who are working in that. So these are all really useful sources for you to look at. You know, we're down to the last 2 weeks here. This is good. We're working under really strange circumstances. I'm aware of that. I appreciate the emails that I've received from many of you. I also really appreciate the work that you're doing with each other online. And that's what's really going to make the class, is what you do for each other online. I'm doing as much as I can for you online. There's more that I wish I could do, but I'm just one person. You're just one person. So think about how you can help each other online, whether it's reviewing each other's drafts, following up on some comments that someone makes on your draft, just reading somebody's paper and offering them a note, even if it's not a full review, or if you hear about an interesting resource, or if you think of something, share that with the person. So this week we're reviewing you know, drafts, revised drafts. We're offering feedback on developing those. Next week we'll be looking specifically at editing. How do I deal with fine editing points that are less about creativity and are more about presentation and understanding. So I look forward to seeing you online, and you know, whatever I can do to help you out, let me know. And now I will find a way to pause this video, I think.